Hi, everybody. Today we're talking about Chapter 15, Urban Unrest. And so we're looking ultimately at the experience of conflict and tension that exists inevitably within urban areas, within any kind of social setting. But again, we're talking ultimately here about cities. So we begin by clarifying some themes. And so the first of these really is order. And so this sort of harkens back to the functionalist perspective within sociology, what has sometimes been referred to as the order perspective, wherein we're examining what ultimately are the parts of society that come together to create a coherent whole or a coherent social organism. And so the same is said to be or could be said to be the case for cities and urban areas, that we've got different unique neighborhoods and groups and subgroups within those neighborhoods. We've got different kinds of workers. We have different structures within cities, institutions that are ultimately tied to how the city works, including government and related organizations that government controls. But we're also looking at community organizations, volunteer associations, churches, mosques, synagogues. And so with respect to order, to emphasize that way of looking at things, and again, that's ultimately tied to functionalism, we're looking at the tapestry of connections, the web of connections and interactions that ultimately create and sustain urban life. And so a lot of how sociology and the social sciences began ultimately had to do with diagnosing, in a lot of respects, social problems, identifying them, and coming up with suggestions and recommendations for how to go about them. And so, with respect to the order or the functionalist perspective within sociology, especially as it applies to cities, we're often looking at, well, what is making things less ordered? What is contributing to dysfunction? Because again, we're looking at how things work. Where do things get gummed up and weeded uh, in the weeds, so to speak? And so, with that in mind, typically functionalism assumes that things that don't work for the whole, that don't contribute to the stability of the whole, will eventually get weeded out, or the problems will work themselves out because efficiency is the way to go. And so, in a lot of respects, that's one of the challenges that we can have with this way of looking at things, that there is this perhaps automatic tendency to de-emphasize or to explain away problems, that, well, they'll eventually go away, they'll eventually work themselves out. That becomes very difficult to accept when we're talking about excuse me, chronic, very debilitating social problems. If we're looking at urban poverty, if we're looking at crime, if we're looking at homelessness, if we're looking at unemployment, it becomes very difficult to just say, well, that'll take care of itself. Again, we're looking at some significant issues. And so, with that kind of way of looking at things, you may recall that we looked at the article Life and Death in the City by John Logan, the urban sociologist, and how it examined a lot of some of these notions of order and what ultimately threatens and challenges order. So, in a lot of respects, there have been um, treatments of that, looks at and examinations of, well, what ultimately threatens order. And often historically, the idea was to directly excise or remove problem areas or problem kinds of environments. And so that's one of the things that we saw a lot of with respect to urban renewal, particularly during the 1960s and the 1970s. And so a lot of what would happen, particularly at the hand of government, typically federal, state, and local working together, would be to go in and take the problem out, to eliminate slum neighborhoods by ultimately paving over those kinds of neighborhoods. And so the Flint neighborhood of St. John's a good example. Again, we talked about Black Bottom and Paradise Valley in the city of Detroit. Those are good examples. Those two neighborhoods in these cities were ultimately done in by highway construction. So the construction of 475 in Flint and the construction of 375 in Detroit. And so the idea here is, well, eliminate the problem by adding something to the area that ultimately or takes out the sort of root of the problem. Um, the challenge, of course, of doing that is that, again, you're looking at a very, very small sort of set of problems relative to what the bounty and the benefit of that community and those communities were, in terms of what Paradise Valley and Black Bottom meant, in terms of what St. John meant to the city of Flint. And so we're looking at, in many cases, networks, tapestries of interaction between neighborhoods, neighbors, next door, people who live within this collective space. They're again connected in very vibrant and vital ways that sustain businesses that were thriving, or that had some kind of resonance within the community. And again, the other institutions that are voluntary, that are community based, that may involve religious or other kinds of cultural or ethnic kinds of traditions, those get removed as well, even when the problems of blight are addressed with respect to urban renewal or something of that sort. And so again, think about what that article talked about, that slum clearance was seen as the way to go about restoring social order. And again, that is key to understanding just the logic of, well, who are ultimately considered to be linked to problems. And so sadly, unfortunately, in the racist heritage and history of our country, areas that were disproportionately dominated by black and brown folks often were the site of these so-called problems that needed to be removed. So we now know within the social sciences and a variety, a host of other disciplines, that much of those approaches definitely had significant limitations and often were destructive in and of themselves. Another core theme, of course, is conflict. That conflict is inevitable, that as you get and have different groups and kinds of people gathering in any kind of space, there's going to be tension over the resources that they have some exposure to or knowledge of: money, power, land, capital, government, and who runs and controls government. These kinds of interactions are not equitably distributed or experienced. And so we're looking often at how power is distributed within society and who has the ultimate reign or control within that power. How is power, if you will, distributed within cities? So if we think about the city budget, which institutions get a greater share of the dollars or the resources that are tied ultimately to a budget? And so this is a big conversation now with a lot of cities. And so we saw particularly as the urban unrest of the 2020 pandemic season increased, the demands often of those within the movements, those who protested, were to defund police, to find ways to redirect dollars from policing to other kinds of institutional endeavors that fall under the umbrella of city services or the mandate of cities providing for their residents and their citizens. And so, so the defund the police, this three-word retort about this, um, unfortunately did not have or capture for a lot of folks the nuance of, okay, we want to shift some of what we're doing so that we're not spending more of our resources on policing and civil service, that we're actually getting dollars directly to the people. Think also about what we said in terms of people-oriented economic development. So that's a lot of what those concerns with resource distribution to policing had to deal with, in terms of, well, how do we get more of these resources, more of this money into the hands of the people? How do we make sure that we're truly helping folks get good jobs, helping them get exposure to jobs programs in their adolescent years, during the summers in particular? How do we do those kinds of things to redirect youth attention towards resources, towards possibilities, and not towards the potential for crime, the street, or violence? So how can budgets within cities be distributed more equitably, such that the city has the resources beyond police, beyond fire, to plant trees, to offer tax incentives to offer programs that help people take better care of their homes and neighborhoods. And so that's a big part of what we're talking about. Um, so how can ultimately cities be resourceful, not just for those who are connected, not just for those who are wealthy, and not just for those who are within the government themselves? What can be done to be restorative with respect to eliminating power imbalances that are gaping and glaring and reducing, therefore, the potential of conflict? So, order, conflict, those are two core themes. And again, that's a big part of the core of what the discipline of sociology is all about. A big theme also with respect to urban unrest is simply disinvestment. A big part of what ultimately is the seedbed or sort of the root cause or causes of a lot of urban unrest, a lot of what we saw particularly during the 2020 pandemic unrest period in our cities. A lot of that has to do with long-term pulling out of resources, pulling resources out of cities. And again, think about it. A lot of what we've seen in terms of how cities function is more business oriented economic development. So we've seen that over decades, a succession of decades, wherein, again, the business community has benefited more than the actual communities of the city or cities themselves. And so that's a big part of what we're looking at. So investing in people has been dramatically and systematically reduced. And a lot of the investments that people can experience at a base level have to do with where they live, what municipality they live in. Are there public libraries? Are there public water fountains? Are there facilities that are well taken care of? How are the streets? How are the services to take care of those streets? If someone wants to work for the city, can they find work? Can they find employment? And so we've seen more tax incentives directed rather towards businesses, particularly corporations, with respect to enticing them to do business with cities. And that does keep them around in a lot of respects, or at least it makes it easier for corporations to stay around. But again, in the true day-to-day personal economy of urban residents, of city residents, are they really experiencing what a lot of those benefits toward corporations have to offer? That's where we've got problems. And that's where we often see significant amounts of unrest, even with all the investments that a lot of Michigan cities have made ultimately in corporations like General Motors. We've seen General Motors move tens of thousands of jobs, uh, amounting in the hundreds of thousands in a lot of respects in a multi-decade way. And overwhelmingly, those job losses have been born in cities like Flint and like Detroit. And so those become the seedbeds for unrest because, again, you're looking at dramatic loss of household income, dramatic loss of per capita income. And so what happens when those things occur is you have a significant decline of capital and dollars in the community for day-to-day living. And that becomes what often can amount to a robust criminal response. Because again, people are trying to respond to the lack of opportunity. They've got to create it in some sort of way. Those opportunities sometimes become less and less legal. And that's a big part of what we're looking at. Now, in terms of unrest, you can think of it in terms of urban unrest, in terms of what we see in cities, the kind of unrest that we see takes on different forms. It takes on a lot of different kinds of manifestations. And if we think about what we saw, particularly during 2020, during the time just subsequent to George Floyd's murder, for instance, in the city of Minneapolis, but also among other cities throughout the country, we saw significant uh, if you will, urban unrest that occurred. And this, I should say, urban unrest is on a continuum, it's on a range. There are different ways and different kinds of experiences that urban unrest can take on. And one of the big core examples of this, particularly for 2020, was the urban unrest form known as a social movement. So with social movements, we're looking at organized attempts to produce or resist social change. And so a lot of the direct face-to-face interactions that were tense, that involved what we saw between police officers and those who were there to quell the violence, be they National Guard troops or others, but along with police being the main ones. They, in a face-to-face sense, are interacting with those who are protesting the presence of police or the ways that police go about policing that aren't, again, in a sort of euphemistic way. They're targeting these things, the ways that police treat folks that may not be again, people oriented, just to sort of bring that back again. And so, again, the nonviolent ways to stand and sort of be present and resist the presence and the efforts of police that may be seen as racist or as classist or certainly as combative and inhumane. Those are a lot of what we saw during this period, especially during the second half of 2020. And so we're looking at, again, some significant reasons for why these kinds of things occur. Uh, there's a sense that groups within cities, particularly African Americans and Latinos, are targeted by law enforcement for differential kinds of treatment. The same can also be said and has been said for folks who are poor and working class. And so, again, we're looking at this having a significant collective memory or being part of a significant set of collective memories between law enforcement and between black and brown communities. And so we're looking at that. Also, the seedbed for these things may involve concentrated poverty, and again, not much in terms of the ability for the average person to really have and evince real capital. And so, again, if there aren't a lot of these kinds of resources to buoy people, in addition to feeling pressed by law enforcement, there are going to be efforts to resist it and to dramatically change it. Some of these can and do become riots wherein they can boil over. And so we're looking there at also a lot of what we saw in cities during this time. And so we're looking at the roots of these kinds of experiences often having a lot to do with dramatic, multi generational racial oppression, class inequality, and again, we're looking at incredibly deprived neighborhoods. A big part of what we also saw, especially during the 1960s riots, was a lot of the migration culturally and economically of blacks from the south to the north, a lot of the alienation that was experienced. Think about what we learned in terms of, again, neighborhoods like Paradise Valley, Black Bottom, as well as what we saw in the case of Chicago in terms of neighborhood riots there. We're looking at a lot of these conflicts having boiled over, being intertwined, but also having a lot to do with black migration, the Great Migration, if you will, the phases of that during the 19 teens, but also in the late 1940s. So a lot of these kinds of things also factor in the, again, alienation, the sense of separateness that people may feel from the new environments that members of the community have inhabited, or at least were newer to them during the run into the 50s and 60s and the civil rights movements. Also, a lot of what we see in terms of urban unrest involves just crime of a variety of sorts, and so we're often looking at organized crime activity, particularly gangs. If we're looking at mafia activity, these are kinds of, again, groupings and clusters that are ultimately meant to uh, use criminal enterprise as a way to sustain their operations. And again, in urban areas, you often have a disproportionate concentration of adolescents and young adults. And so these are often the kinds of groupings and the kinds of aggregates that gangs will thrive on, because again, you're often looking at the gang having its own opportunity structure to target such individuals who may come from homes that are less, in a sense, thought to be less traditional. We're looking really at those who come from single parent homes or come from other kinds of less ideal circumstances socially and economically, where they can easily be more easily be recruited and used for the purposes of the gang. And many of these operations can be incredibly sprawling and take on a variety of different kinds of endeavors and outcomes. Protection is one of the big reasons that someone may, and gangs have formed, or someone may join one. And again, we're looking often at protection not simply from other members in the community. We're looking often at the gang trying to make an effort to fortify itself in the threat, or from the threat of legitimate forces within the community. And so gangs have often formed to protect the members and to protect communities from law enforcement and from the scourge and the incursion of law enforcement within the communities. Now, the ideal ways to go about reducing urban unrest and urban disruptions really include reinvestment, redeploying resources strategically in a way that are going to be more people oriented. And we saw a lot of this occur during the 1970s, especially with efforts by the federal government to funnel uh, millions of dollars into urban areas to reinvest in these communities and make them less likely to be riot prone or to bring about urban unrest. So these kinds of things would involve housing assistance, public transit, social and human services. Again, think about jobs programs, education, training, and economic development kinds of programs, those kinds of things. And a lot of that's also being talked about now with respect to the Biden-Harris administration, that reinvestment is ultimately what we need in reducing the possibility of these kinds of urban unrest sorts of issues, problems, and endeavors.